You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 321, and in this one I interview Jenna Overbaugh. Jenna is a therapist who specialises in OCD and is the clinical marketing director over at NOCD. We discuss Jenna's OCD story, postpartum OCD, how the US healthcare system could do more to recognise postpartum OCD, how her husband helped her during her experience of postpartum OCD. Jenna shares some of her intrusive thoughts at that time and some of the exposures she did. We discuss what Jenna wants you to know about OCD more generally, as well as postpartum, finding time for exposures when you also have to raise a child, working at NOCD, and so much more. And thank you to NOCD for supporting the podcast. NOCD offers affordable, effective, and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NOCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head over to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to Jenna for her time and for sharing her story. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And without further ado, here is Jenna. Welcome to the show, Jenna.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. So before we get into you as a therapist, it'd be good to hear, your OCD story, and you can share as much or as little as you want.
Awesome. So I always start out by saying my earliest memories were of me being anxious. I remember having a stomach ache before going to elementary school. I remember being in the front row of the first day of classes, just racing thoughts of, oh my gosh, who do I say hi to? What if I don't get picked for this game or whatever? But I always knew, even from a very early age, if I just did it, it would get easier. And that I hated nothing more than sitting with that feeling of anxiety winning. And so I learned really early on, just go for it. Just go for it. It's somehow going to be easier to just rip off the Band-Aid and do it than to just sit here cowering about it. So, just kind of lived my whole life like that, from elementary school to high school. And then in college, I learned about exposure and response prevention, which is kind of very serendipitous because we don't often learn about that, especially in just a basic psychology course. But when I learned about that and kind of the whole mentality and modality of it, I was like, I have to do this. I have to do this. And so I always knew I wanted to be a therapist, but I didn't want to be the traditional therapist that, some people might generally think of, like where we sit and we talk about feelings and tissues and all of those things. And so it just felt like the perfect fit. And so from that moment on, I dedicated everything to learning about exposure and response prevention, which then just, nicely took me into the OCD community, learning about OCD. And I always maintained a level of anxiety. I would say in hindsight, it was probably a little bit social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. Everything came to a head though, when I had my son. He's now 4. So I had him in 2018. And I remember being heavily pregnant and thinking I would never ask my husband to do anything out of anxiety for me. I would never do that. I might struggle with postpartum depression. I might struggle with postpartum trauma, whatever happens in the delivery room. But OCD, no way. I know everything there's to know. I would never give into a compulsion like that. And then, of course, I have the baby. I bring my baby home. And I remember my first intrusive thought, which was I was trying to put on socks on my newborn, maybe a couple of weeks old. And I had this thought, what if I snapped his ankles? And then I had the subsequent thoughts of, well, why did you have that thought? Does that mean that you wanted to do that? And I remember very vividly dropping the sock and just, the stakes are too high. The stakes are too high. The stakes are too high. I'm not going there. I remember backing away from my son and I told my husband, you have to do this. I can't do that. And you'd think that it would stop there, but knowing now what we know, OCD often snowballs.
Yeah.
pretty soon, I mean, it did not take 3 months of my maternity leave before I was waking my husband up in the middle of the night, trying to get him to accommodate me. I need you to go and check on Eli because I think I hurt him, but I can't find any blood on him. I can't find anything that I did, but I don't think I hurt him, but I just need you to check because I've been up for the past 4 hours. And so it snowballed really quickly. And it got so bad. I was waking my husband up in the middle of the night, going against everything that I thought I knew. And it had this added level of like, I know I know what's going on here. Like, I know logically what's going on here. And I feel so trapped. I felt so trapped. A lot of it just revolved around harm, obviously, a lot of just death themes and fears. It also crept into more sexual intrusive thoughts, difficulty changing his diaper. Did you look too long? Did you really have to push his penis down like that to put his diaper on? And it just got really out of control.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing. I guess, and am I right in saying that you were already a therapist treating OCD at this point?
Yes, yeah. I was already a therapist. So I had started, I had been a therapist now for probably 6 or 7 years, working actively with exposure and response prevention. I was actively practicing at that point. I had my license. I had, in fact, been working at one of the residential OCD and recovery centers, one of the most kind of world-renowned recovery centers for OCD, for residential level anxiety and OCD. So some of the most debilitating cases, I had wonderful supervision, worked under some of the most intelligent and world-renowned professionals in this field. And yeah, now all of a sudden I was there asking my husband to do these things for me. And it was just a really awful feeling.
Absolutely. And I guess I just wanted to highlight that you were a therapist for however many years and you knew OCD, and yet it still managed to creep up on you. Like, just shows you, if it can happen to you, it can happen to kind of anyone,
For sure.
Yeah.
And I thought I was immune to it. I mean, I would say naive, but it's almost ignorant in hindsight, right? Like, I thought that I was immune to it. Like, I have all the knowledge, I have all the skills, so I'm safe, I'm in the clear. But there's nothing like OCD. And I know that now, OCD attaching and latching onto what it is that you value. Like, there's no tolerance for that uncertainty. And I, having been through my own treatment and having come out the other side, I can see that now. And it has certainly helped me see into the experience of what my clients have been struggling with this whole time. And it's definitely made me a more compassionate therapist, more patient. I feel like I can see into their world more, but it was terrible. It was really, really debilitating.
Absolutely. And when, at what point did you clock on? Did you know instantly from that first intrusive thought around the socks that this is probably OCD, or did it take you a while to click that what was going on for you?
I think it took a while for it to click. And I mean, in looking back, I think I fell victim to what so many other people with OCD fall victim to, which is like, the problem isn't these thought processes. The problem is the fact that I need to keep my child safe. Mm-hmm. The fact is that I'm a bad mom, that I'm having these horrific thoughts and I don't trust myself. Like, that's the problem, not the disorder. Mm-hmm. And so I see also where people now have a hard time understanding that the content doesn't matter, that it's actually the disorder. And it kind of just, casts that doubt over you in general as to the fact that it's OCD in the first place. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't think I realized until it started to get quite ridiculous that, like, okay, I have to do something. So another example of how it really was getting out of control. I started especially adding the sleep deprivation to it, right? That added another level of doubt to things. I started to worry that I left him somewhere, either on accident or on purpose. And so I remember I would drive somewhere with him to the grocery store, and on my way back, I would have that intrusive thought, like, are you sure that you got him in the car seat? And, it wasn't enough to just look in the rearview mirror and see him there. I started to have thoughts, are you so sleep deprived that you're seeing something that you're not actually seeing? And so then I had this thing where I had to engage all of my senses. Like it wasn't enough to see him. I had to like talk to him and have him respond back to me. And so I could see him and hear him. And then that wasn't enough. And then suddenly I had to reach back and hold him or, touch him with my hand. And that wasn't enough. I was getting to the point where I was pulling over on the side of the road to unbuckle him from his seatbelt and physically hold him so that I could like check off all the boxes of my senses that he was there and you did not leave him somewhere and you are not so sleep deprived that you are not registering this right now. And I remember it just felt like it was never going to be enough. Like, this is never going to be enough. The stakes felt so high to not check him or to do any of these other rituals, but the stakes were getting so high in the other direction too. Like, I can't keep pulling over on the side of the highway like this. This is dangerous and I'm going to lose my mind. And so the stakes became high in the other direction to not address this and to not get help. And I think that's when I realized I had to take that leap of faith and I had to start contacting an ERP therapist, which was also an added level of difficulty because I was like, where am I going to go? Like, I am the ERP therapist in my area. Where am I going to go? So that was tricky, but it was necessary and it had to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you had to find a therapist you didn't know as well.
Right. Yes. Yeah. For comfort reasons and also just for, legal reasons too. Just it wouldn't have been the best way to go into therapy. I couldn't go to a friend. I couldn't go to a coworker. I had thought like, where am I supposed to go? So luckily I did find someone. And I thought that I was going to judge how ERP was done, or, I would not totally agree with their stance on things, but I wanted to get better so bad. It didn't even matter.
Yeah, good point.
I wanted to get better so bad. It's like, I will stuff my pride away. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So, and I think the other thing, where you were looking back and then having to reach back and then eventually get out the car, pick him up. And it's a good example of how compulsions just stop working over time or lose their potency. And then it just gets more and more and more. And then we go from showering 30 minutes a day to 2 hours. And that's how it happens. Yeah. But yeah, it sounds like a horrible ordeal. And so I want to unpack, I guess, more from you as the therapist now, but you can obviously bring in your personal experience, maternal or postpartum OCD, because I'm sure many people listening experience it.
So I think a lot of times people, they just hear about postpartum depression or just even postpartum. Like, what is quote unquote postpartum? I'm struggling with postpartum, or I dealt with postpartum. I think that's just such a generic and general term that, if you're struggling at all after having a baby, it's postpartum depression. And that's so not fair, because I think research has shown that postpartum anxiety is actually more common and more, commonly experienced than postpartum depression. So, I could go on forever about the difficulties of the mental health system when it comes to new parents in general. I don't know how it is in other regions or in other countries, but here you're pretty much not given any resources for 6 weeks. So finally at your 6-week appointment after you've given birth, you go in, you're given this very face valid depression screener. That's like, have you been crying recently? Do you have thoughts of killing yourself or hurting yourself? It's very difficult to even kind of read, let alone fill out honestly and then give back to the secretary. So yeah, I mean, it's just a dumpster fire kind of from the get-go. We're missing a lot of women because we're just screening for depression. It's this awful assessment tool in the first place. And, we just don't talk about these things, right? Moms already have so much against them in terms of, you have to, love your baby at first sight and have that instant connection. And don't you just enjoy every part of being a parent? we don't talk about not enjoying every moment, not to mention having sexual intrusive thoughts about your baby, right? We don't talk about those things. And so I think a lot of women consequently struggle and experience these things, but they struggle in plain sight. They are dealing with it. They're walking around with it. And they're just like I was, they're walking around thinking they're the only ones. They've never heard about this before. I must be crazy. I must be just a horrible mom. And so I think, lots of things that we could do, but it's a mess. It's kind of a mess over here when it comes to new parenthood, and especially for new moms.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you shared that. I think from the UK perspective, and obviously it's going to differ wherever you are. Obviously, we have the NHS, which covers the whole of the country, so it's a bit more integrated, and they, in theory, follow the same procedures. But yeah, you get checked up a bit quicker. So I think my wife, the midwife, came a few days after birth or 2 days after birth. And straight from the get-go, she's obviously asking, how are you feeling, like mental health and physical health. And then my wife was struggling actually a bit. And they actually mentioned intrusive thoughts because my wife was having some. Obviously, I knew this. I didn't say it. But the midwife picked up on it, which like shocked me in a positive way that it spotted that earlier. Mm-hmm. And then she got referred to the NHS mental health care system, and within a few weeks she was getting seen. Didn't get many sessions, but she was getting seen and getting supported. And then the midwives didn't discharge her for a couple months. They kept her on their books. But yeah, just to anyone listening in the UK though, I'm sure it's going to differ wherever you are. It's kind of potluck sometimes. But yeah,
well, and I know. Go ahead.
No, go for it. Yeah.
I was going to say, and I live in a small community. I was well known in my hospital structure, and, my OBGYN knew that I was a specialist who works with people who have OCD and anxiety. She knew this. It's a small community. She knew my background pretty well. And so I'm always, devastated to tell this story, but this is how it can go for moms here, which is I went and I was in tears. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm really struggling. I'm having these thoughts that I don't want to have about harming my baby or something horrible happening. And my OBGYN looked at me and she said, all moms struggle like this. I think women just need to be easier on themselves. And, if your son needs a pacifier, just give him a pacifier. And that was just devastating to me.
Yeah.
And it angered me. Like my chest gets tight even talking about it because I'm bold. I obviously had the knowledge going in there of what it was that I was struggling with and what needed to take place. And I'm bold and not like I felt confident in being able to be assertive and handling that situation. But how many women aren't? They would just take that response. Okay. Like, I guess that is my experience now. I guess this is motherhood. Okay. I guess I'm just putting too much pressure on myself. Like, it's so terrible. It's so terrible. And I fear that so many women are, if they even get to the point that they can say these things to their professionals, that either one, they're gaslit, they're just kind of like brushed under the rug because motherhood is hard and you're just being too difficult on yourself, or even worse, which I'm most fearful of. We see it far too often where they're actually, sent to an inpatient facility for what the professional thinks is these ego syntonic thoughts of actually wanting to harm their baby, that they actually believe this mom to be psychotic, where these thoughts are wanted. And that's the opposite from the truth when we're dealing with OCD, right? So it's terrible.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you shared it. Because obviously, just as you say, like some mums and dads aren't going to be able to go in and advocate for themselves. Maybe they don't feel armed with the right information or just aren't sure and they think the professional is always right. So just hearing this, hopefully will give them some of that information to kind of fight their corner. Yeah, it's interesting. So Catherine Benfield, who you probably, So she's in the UK, because she had a similar experience to you. And she then went on advocated in the UK around and was writing articles for like the Journal of Midwifery for General Midwives, and like educating them. And so I guess it can be done, but it's kind of can be a slow process to like get the right awareness out there.
Right. And I love that you mentioned moms and dads, right? Like I know that's just my personal experience, and it's just easier to say moms, but this can happen to dads. This can happen to any caregiver. I mean, research even shows that even adoptive parents can experience these intrusive thoughts, right? So, no one is immune to this, no matter what your, family system is. If you are experiencing these things, they deserve the attention, professionally, so that you can get the help that you need. It's not just moms.
No, yeah, absolutely. What kind of a random question, but one that came to me before was, what don't we know about postpartum OCD, or what should we know about it?
That's such a good question. I think what I would want women to know and other people to know, which is not all that different from what I would want people to know about other parts of OCD, right? Or other themes of OCD, is that, we're kind of wired for some of these thoughts, right? So especially new parents, right? So what is the purpose of a worry but to jolt you into problem solving? Hopefully, if it goes down the problem solving route, not necessarily the rumination route, but the purpose of these intrusive thoughts or images or experiences is to kind of, check you, right? Like, do you actually care enough to not do this? So on and so forth. And so research obviously shows that everyone experiences these thoughts or images, so on and so forth. So it's not the thoughts that are the problem. It's our interpretation of them as being significant, and therefore, the safety behaviors that happen afterwards. And so I guess what I would want people, especially new moms, to realize is like, we're hardwired for some of these thoughts. So much research is coming out now about just how many women experience obsessions and compulsions and those types of tendencies leading up to the birth, and then certainly after the birth. So even if it doesn't reach full-blown OCD where it's disordered, they're new moms are definitely at a heightened experience and heightened kind of vulnerability to experience these intrusions. So I think that really comes down to, I call it a triple whammy. So OCD is going to have a field day with anything that is uncertain. And what's more uncertain about having a newborn or even a child and a toddler, right? Like that all is so uncertain. Are they healthy? Are they sleeping through the night? Am I doing enough? So on and so forth. So that whole experience of having a child and being a new parent is so uncertain. I think the next thing that OCD really latches onto is obviously anything that we value. So especially as a new parent, what more do we value in those moments, or in general, more than our own child or children, right? And then we also know that OCD latches onto what we feel responsible for. So, we have that heightened sense of responsibility, bringing a child, a newborn baby, and especially the moms in that newborn phase. We feel totally uncertain about that. We feel so responsible for this human being. And it's obviously the most valuable thing in our lives at that point. So it's just the perfect melting pot. Put some hardwired maternal instincts in there to be anxious so that you can be vigilant and so that you can act. And honestly, I think it's a miracle that not more women are coming forward, that not more women are struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder, especially after birth, because it's really, truly the perfect mixing pot for women to be struggling with whenever they have a baby.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think, I predict, there's probably research on this, that a lot of it is getting misdiagnosed as sort of postpartum anxiety. And then therefore, I guess they're still probably going to get ERP if they get the right treatment, but it's not the full thing. But that whole maternal instinct, like I can add the male perspective to this. So when my daughter was born, for about the first 2 to 3 weeks, I could barely eat. I was so anxious, but it wasn't an OCD anxiety, because to me, they feel very different. It was I knew I wasn't having intrusive thoughts or anything like that. I was just on super alert in kind of protection mode. And obviously this was the height of the pandemic, because that's when she was born. So if anyone got near her while we were pushing her pram, I'm on alert, ready to attack, to defend. So it just shows you like it's there. So if my OCD wanted to kick in at that point, it would have had a lot of fuel to work with.
Mm-hmm.
You've kind of answered this, but I want to maybe ask it a bit more directly, which is from your experience or your clients, what's extra tough about OCD at this point? You've given birth, you're in the first sort of 6 months of having that baby. What's extra complicated about this?
I think it still comes back to the stakes just seem too high, right?
Mm.
Like to not check your baby in the middle of the night, if that's your exposure. For me, it was exposures to drive from the grocery store back home and not check in my rearview mirror to make sure that he was there, and to not like turn the music down to make sure that I could hear him. In that moment where you're resisting your rituals, everything is going against you, right? Like this is going to be the time where you mess up. This is going to be the time where you actually did forget him. Mm-hmm. This is going to be the time where he's actually not breathing. And you just have all these flashes of how awful that would be. And the regret that you'll feel for the rest of your life if you don't do this ritual and da-da-da. And it can just, you have to want recovery more than you want to give into any of that noise. Right. So, you really have to know what you're in it for, because everything is going against you at that point. You're like thinking that you're a bad parent, and this is going to be the time that everything backfires, and you're going to regret this decision to resist this ritual forever. And you just can't answer any of those questions. And it's so hard, but you have to just keep going forward. And I think what kept me going forward in those moments was knowing that it was just only ever going to snowball, right? Like it was only ever going to snowball. And I didn't even want to think about what that snowball would look like, right? Like if I was already up for 4 hours in the middle of the night, checking my son from head to toe to make sure he didn't have a gashing wound on his body. And that wasn't enough. And I still had to wake my husband up to do it. I don't know what would have been next. I honestly, I wonder if I could see how I would have, wanted to run away. Or I honestly, it pains me to say it. It breaks my heart to say it, but I can see why some women in the height of those moments, if they don't know what's going on and if they don't have the help, I can see why they, hurt themselves, or why they, unfortunately sometimes commit suicide. And I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to get to that point, and I knew it could get there. And so I think that's what helped me keep going and not give into those rituals. Yeah. But what's really hard at this point is whether it's your baby, whether it's your dog, whether it's the safety of your home, whatever it is, for whatever your theme is, I know now how important it feels. It feels so important, but you just have to keep moving forward. And it's really hard to do that, but you just have to, leave all of that in the dust, and you have to just keep going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really good points. Raising a kid and a baby is hard enough, and puts you to your wit's end as it is. And then you add OCD on top of that. I wanted to ask a question around, trying to find time between session to do exposures, as exposure homework can be challenging for some people. But when you add on top of that, you also have to raise and nurture this child and this baby. How was it for you, or even for your clients, finding that time between kind of, whatever things you do for the baby?
I tried to do a lot of 2 birds, 1 stone type of thing. So on my way to get him from school or whatever, I would listen to challenging audiobooks. I really, really struggled with books or any type of content where a child died, where a child, was playing on the balcony and the mom wasn't paying attention and he fell through the bars of the balcony. there were so many times where before treatment, before things really came to a head where nope, I don't want to listen to that. Nope, don't want to go there. And I would turn it off and I would not listen to it. There were other situations where I would hear about a friend of a friend of a friend who knew someone whose child wasn't doing well or was in the hospital or had died unexpectedly. And those things were really difficult for me. So I would try to two bird, one stone it, where I would, on my way to get him, I already have to go and get him for daycare anyway. So instead of listening to my typical, feel good music and avoiding listening to this audiobook, I'm going to purposefully go back to that book that I knew that I was avoiding from 2 years ago. And I'm going to go to the chapter where that baby fell off of the balcony and the mom is just sitting in that devastation and that perpetual guilt for the rest of her life. And I'm not going to listen to it once. I'm going to go back and I'm going to listen to it 1,500 times if that's what I have to do. And there were other things, little things that came up on the news, or I remember I heard once, because if you're looking for it, you're going to find it, right? So I remember there was a news article that came out about some artist who lost a baby. And so they had like a hit song about their experience of losing that baby. And I was like, nope, don't want to go there. Don't want to go there. And so I would effortfully go out of my way to listen to that song, and I would read the lyrics and I would sing it out loud and let myself feel all the things. So I would do that intentional exposure work. I think that's really important, to go out of your way to show the OCD who's boss. And I'm not just going to be here waiting for you whenever you show up. Like, I'm going to come for you. I think that more offensive stance is really important, but I also found a lot of benefit just in my defensive stance, right? So I have to go to the grocery store. Instead of having my husband do it, I'm going to make sure that I do it. I'm going to make sure that I get myself to the grocery store. I bring Eli. And as I'm carrying my grocery bags out to the car, I know, okay, I'm going to put him in his car seat and I'm going to drive. Put him in his car seat, I'm going to drive. And I know I'm going to feel the urgency to go back and check, or to, be extra effortful about his seatbelt, so on and so forth, so that I can have that in my memory that you definitely locked him in the car seat. I'm just going to keep going, doing the opposite of kind of what the OCD would want me to do. And it felt irresponsible. It felt risky. It felt scary. It felt anxiety provoking, but I always just tried to keep my focus on the behaviors. Okay, I'm putting him in his car seat and I'm driving. Yep. I really want to check the mirror right now, but I'm not doing that. My eye is on the prize. I'm driving. I'm driving forward. So yeah. And eventually it wasn't conscious at all, right? Like, I think this is the inhibitory learning model in place, right? Like, I don't think there were ever times where I brought him home from the grocery store and I collapsed out of gratitude. Like, oh my gosh, he made it. I'm so happy. But obviously I've done it hundreds of times now. And I don't know for sure. I guess I could be hallucinating this whole entire thing, but he's still here. I mean, he's still here. So, yeah. And I shudder to think, honestly, like, had I gone the other direction, I don't think I would be here right now. Honestly, I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving those examples. I think that illustrated it really well. And I guess for your husband, right? Married. Yeah. So for your husband, what were some of the things, I'm sure he got things wrong, as we all do, but what are some things he did that really helped you through this process, or the other partners you've heard of from your clients?
So I'm going to really show my cards here. My husband is actually also an ERP therapist, okay. Except he works with prolonged trauma therapy. Okay. So, but he knows, right? Like, he knows that, he shouldn't have taken over sock duty for me that night, but he did. He knows, he knew in the middle of the night when I've been up for 4 hours and I've been checking Eli. I don't think I heard him, but I need you to go check just to make sure. I'm sure he was torn, right? I'm sure he was torn. And that's one of the most heartbreaking pieces. And looking back at all of this is, I know he's very logical. He's like the opposite of me. Pretty unflappable, I guess you could say. So I'm sure it tore him to pieces to want to support me and to know how bad I was struggling, but to do the complete opposite of what he knew, what he needed to do. Right. Like I can't even imagine the difficult place that he must have been in to know that he shouldn't be doing these rituals for me, that he shouldn't be giving me reassurance. And he did it anyway. It must have been really bad. That's what it tells me. So, I think in the beginning, he definitely did. We were so lost. We didn't know what to do. He did, take over the sock duty for a while. I don't think I put socks on Eli. And then of course it snowballed into other dressing, right? So it wasn't just the socks, it was the pants and it was the shirt. And then it was any type of anything. Like I can't do anything because I'm going to snap his arms. Right. So he took over a lot of those duties. I found that one of my sneaky rituals was just confessing. Like I felt the need to say, like, I had this really scary thought. I just had this intrusive thought that, like, what if I was looking at his private parts for too long when he was in the bathtub? And it's really interesting how sneaky OCD can be, because it was like, I didn't even need him to say anything. I didn't even need for him to say like, oh, honey, that's fine. Like, it's just an intrusive thought. Like people think that stuff all the time. You would never do anything to hurt him. I didn't even need him to say that. It was almost like his non-reaction was like, oh, okay, cool. It's out there. It's out. It's off of my chest. That uncomfortable feeling of it being within me. And I don't like that feeling of it being in me. It's out there. Okay. So I'm not that much of a creep because I didn't have this thought and keep it to myself. I at least have it out there in the open. Right. Yeah. So that was a sneaky ritual that I'm sure other people give into too. But once we both started really committing to the treatment process, I was open with him. I told him, like, when I just like say these things to you, I want you to know my thought process and why that's probably ritualistic. It helps me in the moment, but it makes me feel worse in the long run. And so now he will say things like, I love you, but I'm not answering that. And like, I don't want to hear about that. It's not good for you to be saying that. Or it's actually really funny. So 4 years into parenting now, and everyone laughs at me because I don't know when my husband is supposed to come home from work. My mom will sometimes ask like, oh, well, when is Tate coming home? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't ask him, because that was one of my rituals, is to ask him, when are you coming home? When can you be home? When are you going to be home? When are you going to be home? Because I knew if I can just make it to when the garage door opens, then I'm okay. Like, then I won't have hurt Eli or like that tiptoey feeling. I don't need to worry about it because Tate can handle everything then. And so I would just, oh my gosh, I spent the first 2 years of Eli's life waiting to hear that garage door opening. And so to this day, I mean, I would say that I haven't met OCD criteria for a year and a half now. And I still, to this day, I don't know when my husband's coming home, because it's just, I told him, this is why I ask you so repeatedly. Like, I need to know when you're coming home. You can't tell me that anymore. Like, even when he slips up and tells me, hey, I just wanted to let you know, I'll be home at 5 tonight. I tell him, you're not supposed to tell me that. I don't want to know. Like, it's not good for me to know that. So I think it really requires it requires good insight, right? About your own behaviors, why you're doing it, even the sneaky ones. And, telling your partner, like, I'm going to try really hard to keep myself accountable. And in those small percentages of times when I can't hold myself accountable or I slip up, I need you to do this instead. And he would say, if I asked him by mistake when he would be coming home, he would say, I'm not telling you that. You told me that that's not helpful. So I'm not going to tell you that information. Sometimes he would just straight up not answer my questions. Or just, I love you, but you're on bath duty tonight. And it stunk at first, obviously, like, oh, I really wanted that relief, but it's obviously it's got to be supportive in a way that's not accommodating. Yeah, so
lots of teamwork there of like communication about what's actually helpful and healthy for you and how he can be involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm sure, that develops over time. Okay. So, and also the other thing that came to my mind is you've got to trust him somewhat, because he could be like, well, if she doesn't care what time I'm back or want to know, I'll just go to the cinema for a couple of hours, then I'll go home. And she can't have a go at me because I didn't say.
He could, although he probably wouldn't go to the cinema. He'd probably go to the bar, or just hang out like on his phone in the driveway or whatever. He's kind of boring like that, but but yeah, that's one thing, right? And sometimes this is a really good point that I would love for like my members at NOCD. I try to tell them, like, sometimes for the sake of your recovery, you have to do things that are a little bit not normal. Like, yes, it is probably normal for a husband and a wife to know like when they're coming home, but what's good for my recovery is to not know when he's coming home. And so I'm willing to sacrifice that little bit of normalcy because I know that it's really not good for me to know when he's coming home, because then I find myself looking at the clock, and then I find myself white knuckling, only 5 more minutes or only half hour. How do I strategize? What tasks are scary so I can leave them for my husband instead of me just doing them, assuming that he'll be home late? It's not good. And so I guess like the piece of advice there is to just, you have to have your recovery at the forefront of your mind. And sometimes you might have to sacrifice some normalcy for that. And that's okay. Like, my life is not normal. My brain is not normal. But I'm doing the best that I can. And recovery on an ongoing basis is super important to me. So yeah, I don't need to know when my husband's coming home.
Yeah. Good point. And you mentioned NOCD there. And when you say members, that's NOCD's term for patients/clients, right?
Yes. It's hard. It was hard to get into that habit, and now it's really hard to break.
Okay. It's all good. Anyone listening that may have wondered what that meant. So yeah, let's just talk briefly about NOCD. What's it like to work there?
I'm obviously super biased, but I love it. So, obviously I've been working with this community since 2008. So like more than 10 years, holy cow, like 11 or 12 years. And I always say I learned more about OCD in the past 2 years that I've been at NOCD than I feel like I have in the collective, like 8 years before NOCD. So, the training that we get there is really spectacular. And what I love is how just open they are, and they actually can see how your lived experience with OCD can be quite a gift. So in other places that I worked at, I was made fun of for making sticky notes or to-do lists, or even during the pandemic at times in my old job, it was like, don't let your residents see you using hand sanitizer. You're going to have to explain that to them. And it's like, I don't agree with that. Like, I don't think that making to-do lists is inherently bad. I don't think that using hand sanitizer is inherently bad. We have to be more eloquent and more sophisticated in our teachings and in our approach, right? Like, therapy is not that simple and straightforward as this is bad, this is good. We have to teach them about the function of the behavior. Like, what's the function of you making that to-do list? What's the function of you using hand sanitizer? What would happen if you didn't make that to-do list? Could you manage it? Could you tolerate it? Could you be flexible and move forward? And so whereas I felt like before it was like, hush, hush, like keep that all secret. Here it's like, we love that you have that lived experience, right? Like it obviously stinks, but you can help people in such a more illuminative way. You understand the experience, and they don't work to, push that under the rug at all. They really just, are there to help you and use your gifts. So I really respect that out of them as an organization. And I really love, they're really into advocacy, into how advocacy plays a part in the overall recovery process, right? So what I think is really cool about NOCD is even after you're done with therapy, even after you're no longer seeing your therapist, you're only seeing them for a couple, once a month or so on and so forth. It's like, how can we support you? How, like, do you want to come back for a webinar? Do you want to come on our Instagram? Do you want to come and do this? Do you want to write a blog for us? Can, you know, do you want to volunteer? Do you want to do some advocacy stuff to help your recovery? And so I think we're just so internally invested in the experiences of helping people who have OCD. It's really inspiring. And yeah, it's really a great place, a great job. And it's great to do exposure and response prevention with people on a daily basis, because it's obviously so effective. And it's really just a dream. It's a dream come true.
Yeah, I agree. I do like the way they bring in advocacy and the community that they've built and how it all kind of interweaves into the therapy too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's go to, if you could pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old Jenna, what would you tell her?
I would tell her that things are going to get a lot more complicated than you think. But it's also going to get so much more beautiful than you think. So I think something that has really come to my attention, and I think this is from John Hirschfield. I'm going to butcher like what exactly it's called, but like the book, and you would probably know, Stu, so you can help me out. But, you know, this idea that we all have access to certain thoughts, right? Like, what are we going to get from the grocery store? What do we need to do today? You know, sometimes with mental health conditions, in particular OCD, we have access to these really, really dark thoughts. You know, like, could I have been so sleep deprived that I left my son somewhere and I don't know? Could I have accidentally been so sleep deprived that I ran my son's head through a wall and I don't remember that? You know, it's really creatively awful and scary thoughts. But I've come to realize that I have access to a lot of really creatively beautiful thoughts too. Like, I love my son so much. My heart is too big for my body when it comes to my son. I think I have access to so many types of feelings and ideas and, you know, expressions of love that maybe other people who don't have OCD wouldn't have access to. Right. So, you know, something that I always was fearful of, you know, was spending alone time with my son. Now, as a continued part of my recovery, every 6 weeks or so, I just book a hotel in, you know, Milwaukee or 2 hours away. And we go to the zoo, or we just go out to a new restaurant and we spend the night in the hotel together. And that is so special to me. I look forward to those times so much because I know what it was like to not even want my husband to go take a shower. Right. So I remember being scared of my husband leaving to take a shower. And now I can go on a week-long vacation with my son completely by myself. And it feels amazing. And I have such gratitude for that in a way that I never, I think, would have had I not gone through the experiences that I had. So if I were to call a 20-year-old Jenna, I would say, buckle up. It's going to get way more complicated than you think. Like, what you think you know is literally just a drop in the bucket. It's going to get so much more complicated than this, but it's also going to get so much more beautiful, and just be ready to take it all in.
Yeah, I like that. Nice. So you got a billboard wherever you live. What do you want written on that billboard for everyone to see?
I would want people to see something along the lines of do it for your tomorrow self. Do it for your 2 week from now self. Do it for your, you know, future self. I think so many times we act on fear because of how it feels now, because it's scary now. I don't want to do it now. This feels so overwhelming right now. But what about how you're going to feel when it's over? What about how you're going to feel the next day? What about how you're going to feel when you have to do it the next time? Right. So I think, if anything, even when I was a little kid, right, I always had the vision that was always brighter in my mind was the tomorrow Jenna, or the 2 years from now Jenna. It wasn't the Jenna who was like scared to death of raising her hand and introducing herself to a brand new group of classmates. It was, you know, Jenna tomorrow, after having gone first, introducing myself, that's going to feel so much better. Right. So I guess if I could have anything on a billboard, it would be do it for your tomorrow self, or do it for your future self, because that's really what we're all in it for, right? We're challenging ourselves now to create experiences for later, where we're stronger, we're more self-confident, we have more self-efficacy, where we're building those muscles that we have to be cheering and working for that long-term self.
Yeah. Excellent way to put it. Absolutely. So lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
I think the only other thing that I would want people to know is that, OCD is sneaky. OCD is so sneaky. So, and it just calls attention again to the fact that it's not about it was never about my son. It was never about forgetting him somewhere. It was never about that. And so one example of this is I would be rocking him in the middle of the night or before bed. And I would always feel this need again to engage all of my senses. You have to look at him the entire time that you're rocking him. You cannot look away. You have to be close enough to him where you're listening to him snore. You have to be really in there and just appreciating how he feels. And that wasn't out of love. That was out of fear. Because if you hurt him or if he dies, you're going to really regret it if you don't remember how that is, right? You're going to regret not remembering that whole experience. It was always if he dies or if you hurt him. So it was never out of love. But even after doing exposures where I allow myself to not sit so close to him so I don't need to hear him snoring, even when I allow myself as an exposure to look the other direction and not necessarily stare at him like a creep while he's sleeping. Just the other day, I posted this on my Instagram. Just the other day, I was sleeping next to my dog. He's older. He's 10. He doesn't have any health problems, but of course my anxiety is like, oh my gosh, you sneezed. You clearly need to go to the vet or whatever. And I remember I was sleeping next to my dog in my bed, and I had the thought that you better roll over so that you can face your dog, because if you don't and he dies in the middle of the night, you're going to regret not having that last look at him. And even though it was 2:00 in the middle of the morning, I'm tired. I don't sleep because I have a 4-year-old. 2:00 in the morning, I still caught myself before I rolled over. And I was like, whoa, I'm not going there. Because I could see from this third person perspective, I could see the similarity. I could see that was never about Eli. This was always about my difficulty with death and regret and that underlying very generic sense of uncertainty that we all have to deal with, right? We all have to deal with death and regret at times and guilt and all those awful, not so pleasant emotions. And I didn't roll over. And so it's just really sneaky. And I want people to know that can be scary, but you can also overcome that, right? with using skills and educating yourself and being on the lookout and really committing to your recovery. It can be sneakier, but it can be sneaky, but you can be sneakier. So there's so much hope. It's really debilitating at times, but it doesn't have to be. There's so much hope out there.
Yeah, great way to end. I love that. And good job catching yourself. So thank you so much for sharing your story, and going so personal, and obviously just your wisdom as a therapist. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was awesome to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NOCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NOCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the-OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.